All right, hello everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the Strength Coach Roundtable. My name is Will Ruth. I am the strength coach for the Western Washington University men's team and the author of Rowing Stronger, the block periodization manual for rowing, published by Row Perfect, and my website is strengthcoachwill.com. I'm joined today by my two fellow rowing strength coaches from the first podcast, Blake Gorley and Joe DeLeo.
Thanks for having us. Happy to be back on. I'm Blake Gourlay. I'm the strength and conditioning coach for Santa Clara University men's rowing. I'm the performance director for the Los Gatos Rowing Club, and I'm the owner of rowingstrength.com. Happy to be back on.
Will, Blake, it's a pleasure being back on with both of you. I'm looking forward to the conversation over the next hour and everything. For everybody who doesn't know, my name's Joe DeLeo. I'm a strength coach. I run a blog on leotraining.io, and I have a podcast as well. Really looking forward to discuss performance with these two gentlemen this afternoon.
All right. So the last podcast, I think we all kind of agreed afterwards that it was real rapid fire, just kind of a lot of Q&A and not a lot of time for us to discuss and argue with each other. So the goal of today is to really dig into the issue of strength training for performance. So we're not talking about injury or injury prevention or diet stuff or nutrition or recovery or anything like that. We'll get to that in later episodes. Today we're just going to focus on the fastest speeds, the lowest splits, and the best performance results. So our first question of the day is going to be, what are our top lifts just for performance? What do you do in the gym to make the boat go the fastest? Blake, you want to start?
Sure. Of course, it's not the easiest to narrow down, but I mean, to make it as simple as possible, I think there's three priorities for training rowers, in my opinion. I think number one is hip function, and what I mean by hip function is you have to have the range of motion, you have to have the mobility in the hips, and you also have to have the control of that motion. So I think oftentimes you can see people that are extremely flexible, or I guess you could call that mobile, or whatever you want to call it, and then they have no control of it, and they still get hurt, and there's something missing there. So I call that hip function, mobility and control, and that's really important in terms of just protecting them from injury, but also if you move better and you move how you were made to move, you're going to operate more efficiently. Number two, I think, is reflexive core stability. So a lot of that has to do with just the position your body's in, and being in balance is going to allow your core to work the way it does, but the way that we live, we kind of have to do things to kind of revamp that reflexive core stability. And then number three would be strength, and the idea is that if we're stronger, we're going to be able to apply a little bit more force to that oar and get a little bit more bend in that oar, and we're going to be able to go a little bit longer. So I mean, if following those three, for hip function, again, there's many exercises, but I would choose the single leg deadlift, and I think Joe touched on this on the last episode, but huge fan of the single leg deadlift. Once you get the mobility, that's going to be one of the things we go to and really try to hammer out well. So can you control your hip on your pelvis and on your femur, and it incorporates balance, it incorporates single leg strength, so it's going to balance out some of those imbalances that we develop as rowers.
Do you use a dumbbell or a barbell, or what do you use to load that?
Yeah, I mean, basically what's available. I'll use dumbbells, or use kettlebells, eventually 2 dumbbells or 2 kettlebells, and then eventually a barbell, once you exhaust those options. But there's just so many positive benefits, and that's what I would do for hip function. For reflexive core stability, I have this exercise that I came up with that I call the rotary suitcase, and it basically mimics the position of the catch. And in my mind, the catch is the most dangerous position for a rower. So you're slightly leaning to one side, so you're flexing to one side. You're in rotation, and that's a really dangerous position, specifically for the spine of a rower. So what I try to do is I put them in a position where I'm reflexively making them fire their core. You guys will understand this more than the audience. I'll try to explain. By combining anti-lateral flexion with anti-rotation. So we kind of go into a kneeling position. We hold a band, and just by holding that band and preventing it from rotating, it naturally just makes all of our core around our spine just light up. And then I also hold a heavy weight by my side, like I'm going to go for a walk with a grocery bag.
I think I've got a mental picture of it, but we'll do like we did on the last one, on the recap, and get a chance to post any videos and links and stuff like that in the blog available on Row Perfect.
Yeah, that one's hard to explain, but basically I'm trying to get them to get their deep core working. And then third, if I were to pick a strength, like top strength exercise, I would go with the trap bar deadlift. And it's just my favorite choice for a deadlift. I think it works well for tall rowers. I think it takes quite a bit of stress off of the spine, and I think it's pretty easy to learn. And then it's just extremely easy to relate to the sport. And we can go into that in more depth another time. I'll let you guys move on.
Cool. Joe, how about you?
So my 3 exercises that I had down here were the Turkish get up, kettlebell swing, and then once the athlete gets to that point, the kettlebell snatch. I think the get up's really important because in that movement you cover pretty much every movement pattern that a human can go through. You have hip hinge, you have a single leg or lunge position, you have rotation. So you're hitting all of these different movements inside of that lift. You also have a push and a pull as you're rolling onto the elbow and transitioning back down to the floor. So that one I think is great. It also offers a really good appraisal of left-right symmetry, and in the case of a rower, it might be asymmetry. So that can also very quickly at the beginning of the session serve as a off-the-cuff screen. Seeing how that athlete is moving and performing on that day. I think the swing is kettlebell swing is great because in terms of performance, you're transferring over, carrying over a lot of the rowing stroke. Learning to fully extend the hips, get the entire posterior chain involved, reflexive stabilization through the core musculature, and maintaining good alignment from head to toe. And then building upon that, making that exercise even more difficult is the kettlebell snatch. And that's taking the lift overhead. It's a complete total body movement, and the reason that I like that one perhaps a little bit more over the Olympic style version of the snatch is, again, you get left-right appraisal. So if the athlete can do it on one side or has a much easier time, it kind of gives you a very good window into some underlying dysfunction that may be going on. And then the final thing I'll say before I kick it over to Will is, I think Blake made a great point with the single leg deadlift, and one thing I would expand upon, and because I think it's a fantastic staple exercise for rowers, is you're not only working that hip, but you really get an anti-rotational component into it. So you can progress, like Blake said, into double dumbbell or double kettlebell single leg deadlift, or you can go to contralateral, so the opposite hand of the stance leg. So the dumbbell or kettlebell being the right hand, you're standing on your left foot. So now you're working anti-rotation as well as that posterior oblique subsystem. So that's really, really important in terms of balance as well as power and strength generation for the athlete.
And so I know that the three of us all use a lot of unilateral exercises, which is, one side of the body going at one time. So like you were talking about with the kettlebell snatch or something like that, that just has, you're operating one leg or one arm at a time. What do you do if you notice that an athlete can pump out, 10 reps on one leg, but only gets 5 reps on the other leg? How do you re-strengthen that asymmetry?
Well, so the first thing is you've identified it, and then to take it a step further is figure out, okay, is it a stability issue that they can't control the movement, or is it actually an inherent mobility issue? There's a soft tissue restriction or a joint capsule that's not allowing a full range of motion. So that would be kind of the next step, is determining, what's putting the brakes on, and then from there you got to implement the appropriate corrective, and get them, to regain full range of motion throughout the lift on the opposite side.
Blake, you got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, when I see something like that, I usually tell the athlete to limit the reps to the weaker side. So I don't want to get the strong side way stronger than the weak side. I'd rather allow the weak side to catch up. I'm not going to apply like more reps to that weak side or more sets. I'm just going to train off of that weak side.
That's what I was going to say too. I think a lot of people will go the route of like, oh, well, my right leg's stronger than my left, so I'll just train my left. I think we should still train the strong side for sure, but do the weak side first and then just match that number of reps with your strong side. So if you're right leg dominant, do as many reps as you can do or whatever's called for on the left leg, and then just stop at that point on the right leg.
Yeah, I agree with both you guys. One thing I'll do sometimes is I'll throw an extra repetition on the weaker side just to help it catch up. And depending on the athlete, this is a great point here, is some might need to start with the strong side first in terms of patterning the movement or learning, grooving the lift properly in terms of technique. But then from a training effect perspective, once they have that step down, it's great to start with the weaker side because the central nervous system is as fresh as possible.
That's a good point. Kind of off of that, more like a rehab idea, is that we know that the nervous system's really kind of what runs the whole system, right? And if someone like injures their left shoulder, for example, a lot of times people will just like stop training altogether. But we know from studies that if we train the healthy limb, we're actually going to recover faster. So we definitely shouldn't just like stop training or ignore different sides. And I think there's definitely something there.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it was that same research paper, but I saw one that measured biceps growth from training the other arm. So they did all their curls on their left side, and they still found biceps growth on the right side, just from, like you mentioned, that systemic effect of strength training.
I think very cool. Yep.
So I'll take a kind of different approach. When I was a rower, I loved lifting. I might have liked it a little bit too much, but my rowers here also love lifting, and my whole kind of thing is the saying, from strength comes all things. So the vast majority of our work is done barbell lifting, and my go-to lifts are kind of like we all talked about, the deadlift. Blake said the trap bar deadlift. I'll actually go a different way and say the elevated deadlift. I like to put it up on like a 4-inch or a 6-inch elevation, depending on the height of the athlete. I think particularly because, the deadlift's the only lift where everybody starts out at the same height off the ground, because the plate's a fixed depth or a fixed height off the ground, whereas like a squat, parallel is parallel, and that depends on the individual athlete, but the deadlift is set for everybody. So I'll kind of modify that for the 6'4" guys and up. Particularly, I have them do it elevated, and that takes some quads out of it, and really heavily loads the posterior chain, the glutes, hamstrings, and back muscles. And I think it also puts them kind of in a similar position trap bar wise. So it's kind of like we're accomplishing the same goal, but with slightly different exercises. That's also just because we don't have a lot of trap bars available to us to use. I think there's one at the gym. If you've got a bunch, then great. I definitely like that as a lift. My next one, I've got front squat. Front squat I like. It really lets you hit the thoracic spine muscles, the upper back muscles, as well as the quads. That's my go-to lower body kind of push strengthening movement. And then the Pendlay row is another one of my favorites, and this one I'll put up a link to as well in the recap. The Pendlay row is like an explosive barbell row that starts off the ground. The reason I like it for rowing is because it kind of trains you in that same catch position. Because if you start the Pendlay row in a bad, everybody okay?
All good.
Okay. Sorry, just heard a large crash off of someone's microphone. We'll figure that out. Anyway, on the Pendlay row, you get an explosive barbell row, so you have to be in a solid core position from the floor. Then it trains you to come off the floor in a proper position and then explosively finish the movement with a drive through. So it's very similar to rowing, and I like that one a lot. And then my final one is overhead press. I'm pretty much fine with however the athlete's comfortable putting the weight over their head, dumbbell, barbell, kettlebell, whatever it is. Putting the weight overhead trains the scapular muscles of the shoulder very effectively, and I think that that's great for providing that stronger upper back girdle and ultimately getting better connection to the oar.
Will, how do you feel about people saying that overhead pressing is dangerous for the shoulder?
I'm not entirely sure that, like any of these lifts that we've mentioned, if you do it wrong or if you've got a mobility restriction that prevents you from doing it correctly, then any lift can be dangerous. I'm not sure that that's the fault of the lift as much as it is the fault of the athlete. And that's not like in a bad way. It's just, get yourself mobile first and able to perform the exercises before you load them. I think that a lot of the overhead press is bad for your shoulder kind of thing came about with like very specialized athletes. So if you've got baseball players or volleyball players or other athletes that are constantly doing overhead motions, then I think that loading that further with the overhead press can be difficult or potentially dangerous. But what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, some people shouldn't be doing it because they're not ready for it. They don't own the prerequisites. But it was actually interesting. I was talking to you about it already. I heard Dan John talk yesterday, and he's one of the experts in our field. And he actually said like the opposite. He's like, I think people have shoulder injuries because they don't overhead press.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, if you just bench press, which is people's kind of go-to upper body pressing lift, you strongly develop the anterior side of the body, the chest muscles, the anterior deltoids of the shoulder, and really not all of those scapular control muscles, the middle trapezius, the lower trapezius, the posterior deltoids, all of those that are really important not only for shoulder function but also for better connection and stability and keeping your chest up when you're rowing. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it too, and also just that it lets guys do something that they can load heavy. And I coach a men's team, so this could be different coaching a women's team, but guys like to lift and guys like to have big jacked arms, and I don't want to fully prevent them from being able to lift.
Yeah, I mean, there is the intimidation factor, and I don't know about you, but every time that I finish a session with my college guys, they go right over to the dumbbell rack, they start doing bicep curls.
Yeah. Well, you got to fill out a uni, so.
The only thing I'd add to the overhead pressing conversation is that technically making sure that you're driving from the lat. Will, I thought you brought up a great point about the bench press. Just watched Mark Rifkin's Super Lats DVD, and he talks a lot about the bench press and the push-up, and he said, think about the bench press. You're lying down on the bench. Your scapula is glued down to the bench. You're not allowed you're not allowing that musculature as well as the shoulder blade to move around the way it's designed to. It's kind of stuck in place. Whereas with a push-up, it can kind of move freely the way it's designed to. And that, that can kind of carry over sometimes into overhead pressing.
Yeah, I think we all have our own kind of ways that we'll progress an athlete. So, I don't start out a brand new rower necessarily doing, overhead press, bench press, that kind of stuff. I'm doing an intake training session with a client later today, and we're going to start with the push-up. We're going to start with the body weight squat, and then we'll see, where we go from there. So assuming that the athlete's healthy and has control and has those prerequisites like Blake talked about, then I think we can talk about more complex exercises. But yeah, they've got to master the basics first.
I think that's a really important point, is because a lot of people nowadays, since we have the internet and YouTube, people will just go online and they'll see an exercise and they'll think it's right for them, and they're not anywhere close to being ready for it. And I think that's why it's important to have educated coaches.
Yep, it'd be like doing a 500-meter test your first time ever rowing. Nope. you got a lot to work on first.
I personally do 2K tests the first day.
Yeah?
No, I'm just kidding.
All right, well, you guys have anything to add on to individual exercise selection before we move on?
Nope.
Cool. So we all know that the strongest person isn't always the fastest person in the boat. You could get a 800-pound squat, or a powerlifter who could squat 800 pounds, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to do a 2K any faster. So the next question I want to talk about is just what are your tips for getting what strength coaches refer to as carryover? So how can we make training in the weight room apply as closely as possible to training on the erg or on the water? What can we do to make sure that all of our work in the weight room transfers over really well to faster boats?
Yeah, I think I don't look at weightlifting as just like going in the weight room, lifting weights, and that's it. I actually look at it as the extension of a practice. So I approach every lift with like another opportunity to say the same thing in a different way in a different environment. And I think that's typically really understated. For example, like when I coach the deadlift, and I've done this with adults, with high school, and with college athletes, and they all display the same issues that they display in the boat in the deadlift. And it's a really good opportunity to just get hands-on with them and say it in a different way. And like in the deadlift, you can teach acceleration. You can teach getting connected with locking that blade in the water before you stand up. You can teach posture, how to pick up weight with a supported spine, which is also really underrated. And hanging on arms, keeping the shoulders relaxed. There's so many ways that you can take it. And to reference Dan John again, he talks about gaps and standards, and I think a lot of rowers are very, very endurance oriented, and I think a lot of them have a gap in terms of their strength. So I mean, in my opinion, strength is the foundation for endurance. Strength is the foundation for power. And if you want to get better, if you want to be able to apply a little bit more power to each and every stroke, if you want to go a little bit longer, filling that strength gap is actually going to make you quite a bit stronger. So I think a lot of people talk about like sports specific exercise and all that, and that's not necessarily the way to do it. If you just teach them to move well, to understand how it connects to the sport, and to like really give them a solid foundation of strength, that will translate to the boat.
Are there any particular tips or cues or anything that you found that get through to a lot of athletes in terms of how what they're doing in the weight room applies to the boat?
On the deadlift recently, I've been actually on every lift. I've been using rate recently, and that actually works really, really well. So if you want someone to do something more controlled, you can tell them to try to do it at a rate 16. Um,
Interesting.
on the deadlift for like locking that blade into the water before you drive. Like you don't want to row that blade in. You want to lock on and really find your legs from the beginning. I really like the deadlift for that because you can hear the click in the bar before you pick it up. You want to take that click out, find a connection, and then you want to apply the legs on it. That's a big one for me. And then if you want to, you can take it even farther, and you can um, just have them treat it like the boat. Like find a connection, accelerate as you stand up, and that really clicks with rowers.
I like that too, and with the deadlift, I'll often refer to it as like being at half slide on the first starting stroke. So same kind of thing. Like you're not rowing it in, you're finding that connection, burning the blade, and then going from there.
Yeah.
Joe, you got anything here?
I do. I think Blake just touched on some great points, and from the deadlift. And one of the things I think all three of us do a great job of is using the environment in the gym when you're strength training to not only enhance the athlete's strength, but really improve their spatial awareness, how they're moving, and their proprioception, creating that sensory-rich environment. And regardless of what exercising they're doing at that particular given moment, the ability to be that much more aware and develop that neuromuscular connection, that mind-body connection, that's what's going to cross over into any sport, rowing, running, triathlon. But specific exercises carrying over for rowing, there's a couple that really come to mind. I think it's super critical to have the ability to create what Dr. Stuart McGill refers to as super stiffness in the torso. Rowers are under an incredible amount of load, especially around the low back. You're hinging through the hips. There's a lot of stress on the low back, as well as a rotational component to the rowing stroke in the boat, especially on the sweep side of things. So bottoms up kettlebell carry, asymmetrical, just on one side, is great. It forces you to really crush grip the handle. You get the lat engagement as well as the QL. Dr. McGill really cites that as something that carries over well. He did that a lot with strongman athletes who would be carrying a super yoke, so just basically an apparatus that had a ton of weight loaded on it, and they'd be carrying hundreds of pounds for distance. They found they got greater EMG muscle activation using an asymmetrical load than with a symmetrical load. So for a sport such as rowing, I think that's a great one that has a lot of carryover.
Right on. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you guys have said. I think one of the main ways that I like to get carryover is through the block periodization system. I know I've explained this in other podcasts, but one of the ideas of that is exercise selection and getting more specific the closer to whatever your competitive season is. So with the college guys, we're basing it all off of the national regatta in May, but that can change whether you're more focused on Head of the Charles or whatever it is, or if you're a Southern Hemisphere rower. In the block periodization system, you start off in the furthest away season, which for us is summer, with the greatest amount of variety. So they'll all have them doing 3 different kinds of squats, a couple different kinds of deadlifts, let them mix it up with different kinds of presses. We've got a large amount of variety, build a really big base of strength. Then the closer we get to the competitive season, the more refined and the more specific that gets. Blake, I liked what you said as far as like not getting too specific. I think we've all known, or we've all maybe been. I know I was that guy doing 200 rep leg press sets because you do 200 strokes in a 2K, so let's just load that up with 200 reps and that'll carry over. But my whole kind of idea is that, just like you said, build it strong and then let the endurance come on downstream from that. So you get specific, not overly specific, but at least in terms of exercise selection, like that's when I'll start incorporating more of the Pendlay row, kind of very similar to the stroke rowing exercises.
Yeah, and to kind of circle back to one of the things you started with was like we know someone that deadlifts 800 pounds may not make a good rower. I think there is a thing such as being too strong. Um, but I also think that there's a good standard for what's going to be successful. Um, and I mean, I have standards laid out for men's and women's high school levels, kind of working on the college a little bit. I don't know if you guys have dug into that at all, but I have a standard of what I think the whole team should be able to do, and then I have like a middle bracket, and then I have like a game changer bracket. And the guys or the women that tend to make the game changer bracket, like they tend to really transfer that strength to the water. And of course there's exceptions, like if you have bad technique and you're the strongest guy in the boathouse, that doesn't mean you're going to be a good rower. Like you still have to balance all of that. Um, but the guys that have like the strongest deadlifts, for example, can usually really apply that force to the water.
Right, because it's hard to be a good deadlifter without knowing how to correctly brace your torso, correctly apply power with the legs, balance that power with the back, kind of everything that we want out of a rowing stroke.
Yeah, I
And then,
agree.
yeah, and then of course there has to be a point of diminishing returns. I think that point is a lot further than most people think it is. And even when you hit that point where it's like, okay, you are now uh, slightly stronger than you need to be for rowing, I think that's when you could turn your focus to other things like power application. Can we start doing more speed work, less max work? That's also part of the specificity trend with the block periodization system, is that like right now we're coming up on our last month of the season. We're doing a lot more speed work, a lot more power application work, and we're just trying to maintain that base of strength that we built earlier in the season. So we're not doing heavy lifting year round, and I think that's a main thing and a mistake that I see a lot of rowers doing, is doing the same set and reps and the same kind of system year round, when you should be training differently based on how close you are to your competitive season.
Yeah, and I think I do something similar to you, Will, in terms of like variety and changing up the phases. I'm sure we talk about it differently and do it in our own different way, but very similar, where like I'll go, start with a very simple, like basically technical phase, progress to a strength phase, and then progress to like a power phase.
Yep. And that's really all that periodization means, is just having a system of organizing your training. So pretty much the only person who's not going to have some sort of periodization system is someone who either does the same thing day in and day out, or someone who picks their workout, at random out of a bingo wheel. Everybody else kind of has some way of planning their training, and that's just a periodization system. There's a bunch of different words for a bunch of different ways to do that. Cool. One more thing that I've got on this is keeping a logbook. And that's not exactly a performance tip, but I think it applies closely to, particularly if you're a self-trained athlete, which I know like a lot of masters athletes out there are. You don't necessarily have a coach with the program, with the weightlifting and the on-water training, kind of everything together, like Blake, I know you have for your high school team, as well as like I have for my college team. So I think if you're a self-coached athlete and you aren't recording everything that you're doing, you're leaving a lot of learning on the table. So writing down what lifts you're doing, what set and reps you're doing, what intensity percentage that's at. So if that's 70% of your maximum, as well as like how you're feeling that day. I have my guys write on a scale of 1 to 10 how much they want to train that day. I had them record their body weight, and I had them record how much sleep they got the night before. And that way they can kind of start tuning that in as well. And I think once you've kind of got enough recorded, it makes it a lot easier to make modifications to where, okay, based on the trend that I've noticed here, I can tell that I'm starting to get a little worn down. I need to back off here, make sure that I taper before the race, whatever that is. And then I think also it helps find exercises that work for you. Not everybody has to do a conventional deadlift from the floor. We all love deadlifts, but we've talked about 4 or 5 different variations of deadlifts that you can do, including conventional from the floor, trap bar deadlift, elevated deadlift. There's a bunch of different ways, single leg deadlift, a bunch of different ways to skin the cat. So if you find that conventional deadlifts make your back hurt or make you too sore for the next day, like find a different exercise that works for you. Don't get locked into just one thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Will, that's a great point, because there's a lot of variance in the setup for the deadlift, and that's gonna really be very individual, depending on injury history, athlete's current ability level, their body structure. You're talking about torso length versus their leg length, and just being able to get them into the appropriate hinge position for them.
Yeah, and I tell my guys all the time too, like it doesn't matter how strong you get in the weight room if you are injured or too sore to perform that on the water. Obviously, there's a time and place where you're going to be more sore before another day, and we try to structure that so it's not, right before test or leading up to a big race. But if you're going so hard at the gym or doing exercises that habitually make you hurt, like what's the point? Like you're not making yourself a better rower. So if you're not at the gym to be a better rower, then what are you doing there?
Right.
Yeah, and I think pain's such a common thing in the sport of rowing that sometimes they just accept that pain is normal, and it's not. And it totally relates back to what you're saying, where you just have to find what's right for you.
Yep. All right, we'll move on to our last question then. And then if any of our listeners out there have any questions, we can get to those, or we've got a bonus question if we have extra time. So we've talked about a bunch of different ways to lift. We've talked about the power lifts of, the squat, the bench press, the deadlift. We've talked some about Olympic lifts, and then we've talked about the odd lifts as well, like kettlebell swings and Turkish get-ups and lifts without, they're odd lifts because they're loaded differently than a barbell or a dumbbell. What's the balance of how you use those different categories? Blake, you want to start?
Sure. It really depends on the team, and it depends on the athlete. And there's been years that I've coached Olympic lifts, mostly hang cleans. But I think there's different ways to produce power and develop power, and it totally depends on what the coach is comfortable with, how big your group is, and what the athletes are, what their ability is. So I mean, I'll always do something to produce power. Currently, I don't use Olympic lifts anymore. I do like the dumbbell snatch. I mean, I think that could probably be considered an odd lift. I do use med balls. I do use different forms of plyos like box jumps. I really like swings. I think it takes a really long time to get people to Olympic lift correctly, and there's people that do it as their sport, and that's it takes so long to do it well, and sometimes just the risk versus reward ratio just isn't there. I think my program's probably made up more of odd lifts, just because I like to allow the body to move more naturally, and I think sometimes the straight bar can kind of get in the way and kind of lock joints in a way that they're not supposed to move. Like, so for example, like instead of doing a barbell bench, you can use a dumbbell bench, and that's going to allow you more range. It's going to allow you to rotate as you push and pull, and most of the time that's going to keep shoulders healthy. I still squat. I don't like to load the back though. Um, I don't think loading the back often is a good thing for rowers. I think they get enough of that in the boat, but I still squat. I just load it in different ways. So mostly goblet squats. Trap bar kind of gets a little bit of the squat in there, um, and then all different types of single leg work.
Single leg work is one of the ones that I would have added into my list for performance in terms of like the rear foot elevated split squat. Um, I think that does fit into that odd list category. It's body weight, it's unilateral. But I think that the interesting thing about using more non-conventional lifts is maybe the better word for it, is how do you tell athletes what load to use? Because presumably they don't have an established one rep max for a dumbbell bench or something like that. So how do you tell them, like, okay, I want you to do 4 sets of 5 at what weight?
Yeah, I'll do like a 5 rep max test, and then sometimes I have to do some conversions and whatnot. But another easy way is just to start at a baseline, see what it looks like. If it looks good, they're doing it well, and they're being challenged. Next week, add 5 to 10 pounds and just progress week to week.
Go, Joe, you're up.
Um, in terms of incorporating different lifts throughout the calendar year, it's kind of like Blake said at the beginning. It's going to depend on the athlete and really what their goal is and the timetable you have, and working backward from that. You have to take into account where they currently are in terms of their ability in the weight room. They might be very mature in terms of training for a couple of years in rowing, but they might be a novice when it comes to strength training. So you have to take that into consideration when designing their program. But that being said, balancing different modalities, I mean, one of the things that I'm mixing in a lot of now is a lot of body weight work. So push-ups, moving to one-arm push-up, and then eventually to a one-arm, one-leg push-up, pistol squats, doing pull-ups, tactical pull-up. A lot of focused abdominal work, I think, is really important. Going back to that super stiffness in the torso for athletes, and making sure that they're as well-rounded as they can be. Yep, that's it.
So my kind of comment or question on that is I really liked what Blake said about, and I think we've talked about this before, with Olympic lifts being a sport in and of themselves that people dedicate their entire athletic career or lives to, and still wouldn't say that they do it perfectly. How does that same kind of philosophy apply to some of those more complicated bodyweight lifts? Because some of those are almost getting into the gymnastics area, particularly like the pistol squat and stuff like that, that rely really heavily on balance. Do you think that you can still tax their muscles adequately enough with more complex bodyweight lifts like that?
Yeah, you just have the appropriate regression. They're obviously not going to start off doing a full bodyweight pistol squat. Nobody does. I mean, you need an incredible amount of hip mobility and ankle mobility, as well as reflexive stabilization to do that exercise. But that's also, again, a great way to screen on the fly. If they can do that on one side and they can't do it on the other, that's a big red flag to me immediately. So regressions would be, using kettlebell or dumbbell or some sort of counterbalance, having them use a box to sit back as they're hinging back on a single leg. It's finding the appropriate regression, and they're very taxing neurologically. One thing I will say about the body weight lifts is you don't need to do a high number of reps. You're creating a lot of total body tension, and it's very, very fatiguing neurologically. It's completely different stress than barbell, kettlebell, dumbbell. um, people will feel like they're completely wiped out 2 to 3 days afterwards, like they feel like they've got the flu because it's such a high central nervous system load.
Looking at a variation of the pistol squat, I have athletes do single leg squats, and I had an athlete one time say, like, I'm doing this single leg squat to a bench with 5 pounds held out in front of me, which is actually makes it a little easier. The counterbalance that you talked about, Joe. And he's like, it feels like a heavy leg press. And they're just using their body weight to stand up and sit down to a bench.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think a wonderful one to learn is take a counterbalance and go narrow stance, like so feet are together, squat all the way down as you're extending the weight away from your body, and then when you get to the bottom, you're extending one of your legs, and then you stand up single leg, and you can obviously regress that and put a box under their butt so that they're touching the box, and they can improve their depth over time. But that's a great way that they go down very safely, they learn to extend, and then they're working just on that one phase.
Yeah, I will say I compete in strongman. So Joe, you mentioned the yoke walk earlier. The single leg stuff is really helpful for particularly that and the farmer's walk and the other competitive events. I hate rear foot elevated split squats. It's like one of the few exercises in my training that like I would just love to not do these, because even body weight or just with a couple 10 to 20 pound dumbbells, like they're still so difficult, and yeah, they are very effective, but almost too much.
Right.
I think I'm probably one of the few people that actually love RFEs. But I mean, that's also telling you like that there's a gap somewhere, right? And like you said, like when you work on those gaps, it makes you stronger in other aspects.
Yep. My programs, I tend to be pretty heavy on the power lifts. I also don't use Olympic lifts. Kind of the same thing. They're just too complex to be able to teach someone how to, and then get them to reliably do it. I liked what Blake said about finding different ways to train power application. One that I've used in the past is close stance box squatting. So I'll have them. It basically makes it kind of like a deadlift, but you have the bar on your back instead of in your hands. So you've got your feet in pretty much your rowing stance, and then you're sitting back to you're a little bit above parallel, kind of like the same hip height as on a deadlift, and then doing box squats from there. It's a great way to still train that explosive hip extension. And Blake, you mentioned plyometric exercises as well, and it's way simpler than having to teach someone how to do that with a full clean or even a hang clean, let alone snatch. So I use almost no Olympic lifts. The one that I will use with some athletes is the high pull, and the high pull is just off the ground. It's basically the first and the second part of a clean. So they don't catch it in the rack position. They just basically end with it all the way up. One thing that I've actually gotten into arguments with people before about is rowing a triple extension sport, and I don't see how it is. So Olympic lifts, like the purpose of Olympic lifts is to train triple extension, which is extension of the ankles, knees, and hips. Okay, so in rowing, you don't extend the ankles because you're locked into your foot stretchers. You extend the knees, and the only time you extend the hips is when you catch a gnarly crab and get knocked over backwards. So for me, I really want to train power application of the quadriceps, but training that full explosive hip extension is just not necessarily a goal that I think is that beneficial to rowing. Do you have any thoughts on Oli lifts on that?
I agree with you in terms of the comment about the triple extension, and I think the demands for being an athlete in the sport of rowing are vastly different, even conflicting for the Olympic lifts. And what I mean by that is that you need to have certain prerequisites that you can fulfill movement-based without load to be competent and be able to move well throughout the Olympic lifts. And you're getting into a position where whether you're doing the clean or the overhead snatch, you're in full extension. You need very good thoracic mobility, very good hip and ankle mobility. And in rowing, you're basically in a lot of flexion throughout your thoracic spine and sometimes the lumbar spine. Not ideally, but that's what happens in the sport.
Yeah, if you're an athlete who jumps or sprints, then there's no doubt that you need to train explosive hip extension. But for rowing, I mean, still train some hip extension. We all do that through good mornings or deadlifts or kettlebell swings or whatever it is. But that explosive hip extension is just not required to the extent that it makes sense to use the Olympic lifts.
Right.
And then I've been incorporating more odd lifts, and I've been learning a lot from you too on that in terms of the benefit, but particularly with like the body weight stuff. I've been using more and more of those rather than dumbbell or barbell lifts, like particularly for assistance work. So I pretty much always have them start with a power lift, sometimes two, because I tend to have them do full body workouts. So they'll start with a front squat and an overhead press or a push press or something like that. And then from that point onward, it's mostly odd lifts in terms of smaller isolation exercises, whether that's push-ups or rear foot elevated split squats or chin-ups or something like that. So I'm getting there. I'm open to it.
No, that's awesome. I think it's fun. Just I'm sure we're going to look back in 10 years and we'll probably still have some of the exercises we're talking about here be staples, and then there might be stuff that is completely different from what we're currently doing, and that's just part of growing and knowledge and expertise and finding the right mix for what we're doing and for the athletes.
Well, I think that a lot of it too comes down to how much time you have with the athletes. So Blake, I know you've got a pretty awesome situation down there in terms of being close to the water facility. Do you get out on the water with them, or are you just kind of there?
So I'm with Santa Clara just for weights. I'm actually going to start making it practices more often, but for the high school program, I'm the rowing coach for the novice men, so I'm on the water with them every day, and then helping with weights for everything else. Yeah,
that's an awesome situation to be in, because then you know what they're doing on the water, you know what they're doing in the weight room, you know that they're not getting conflicting information from so-and-so coach says this, I say this, so-and-so coach says that. Not that any of those are wrong, but just as an athlete, it can often be confusing. And then you've also got a lot of quality instruction time with them. I wish I had more instruction time with my athletes, and I would program a little bit differently if I had them in small groups multiple times a week kind of thing, because then I could afford to do some exercises that require a higher level of instruction.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest factor I think that any of us face is the amount of time that we have with a group of athletes or an individual.
And especially in a sport like rowing that has so much training time invested in it, like you need to spend a certain amount of minutes every week on the erg and in the boat, and that's just how it is. So you can only get so much time with them. They're student athletes as well. A lot of times, or if they're masters, they've got a job. So you only have so many training hours per week, and kind of the more training time that you have with them, the more individualized and the more complex your programming can be.
Absolutely.
Well, we're actually just about on time here. So, do you guys have any last comments on strength training for performance before we wrap this up?
No, I thought this was a blast. Learned a ton from both of you, as always, and thank you for having me back.
Yeah, same here. Do we have time for any follow-up questions, or are we good?
I haven't gotten any through Twitter or anything like that, so we'll probably go ahead and wrap it up and post the recap. And if you do have a question, like if you're watching this later on YouTube or SoundCloud or iTunes, feel free to either drop us a comment on YouTube or on the Row Perfect recap that we'll put up, or you can Twitter or Facebook message or email any of us with your question. My Twitter address is willruth335, and I'm on Facebook as Strength Coach Will. You guys go ahead and sound off with your handles too, so people can get a hold of us.
Go ahead.
So my Twitter handle's at jdeleo, JDELEO. And then my email is joe@leotraining.io. And
mine's simple. It's Twitter is at Blake Orley. So BlakeGourley. And then my email address is blake@movementevolution.com.
So if you do have questions about rowing training for performance, feel free to contact any of us, and then stay tuned for episode 3. We'll be announcing the topic and date shortly. Thanks everybody for joining us. So long.